They laughed when the dump trucks arrived. 3 massive trucks carrying 60 tons of sand, backing up to my small cabin in northern Minnesota, preparing to unload what my neighbors called the stupidest waste of money they'd ever seen. But I wasn't stupid. I was a retired physics teacher who understood something about thermal mass, heat capacity, and energy storage that most people had never learned. My name is Dr. Raymond Chen. I'm 67 years old, and in the summer of 2019, I did something that made me the laughingstock of my rural community. I filled the crawl space beneath my cabin with sand. Not gravel, not insulation, not any conventional building material, just plain, ordinary sand. 60 tons of it. And that decision, which seemed insane to everyone who witnessed it, would eventually prove to be one of the smartest things I'd ever done. But let me start at the beginning, because the story of why I filled my crawl space with sand begins with a problem that every northern Minnesota resident faces: brutal winters and astronomical heating costs. I'd retired from teaching high school physics in 2018 after 42 years in the classroom. My wife Linda and I had bought a small cabin on 10 acres of forest land about 30 miles outside of Duluth, planning to spend our retirement surrounded by nature, away from the city, living simply and peacefully. The cabin was charming but old, built in the 1970s with minimal insulation and a pier and beam foundation that left a 3-foot crawl space between the floor and the frozen ground. That crawl space was the source of most of our heating problems. Cold air would infiltrate from below, making our floors ice cold and forcing our propane furnace to work overtime trying to maintain comfortable temperatures. Our first winter in the cabin, 2018-2019, was a brutal education in the realities of heating an old building in Minnesota. Our propane bills averaged $450 per month from November through March, totaling over $2,000 for the heating season. The cabin was never quite warm enough, the floors were always cold, and we were burning through our retirement savings faster than we'd planned. I spent that winter thinking about the problem from a physics perspective. The issue wasn't just poor insulation, though that was part of it. The fundamental problem was thermal mass, or rather, the lack of it. Our cabin was built with wood framing and thin walls, materials with very low heat capacity. That meant the building couldn't store heat effectively. When the furnace ran, it would heat the air quickly, but as soon as the furnace shut off, that heat would dissipate rapidly through the walls, windows, and especially through the floor into the cold crawl space below. The cabin had no thermal buffer, no way to store heat and release it slowly over time. Every BTU of heat we generated was either immediately useful or immediately lost. There was no middle ground, no storage capacity that would allow us to capture heat when it was abundant and release it when it was needed. I started researching thermal mass solutions, looking at how different materials could store and release heat. I studied concrete, brick, stone, water, and various other materials, comparing their heat capacity, cost, and practicality for retrofitting into an existing structure. What I discovered was fascinating and would eventually lead to my sand solution. Heat capacity is measured in BTUs per pound per degree Fahrenheit. Water has the highest heat capacity of common materials at 1.0 BTU LB DGF. That means 1 pound of water can store 1 BTU of energy for every degree of temperature change. Concrete is about 0.2 BTU LB DGF. Stone is similar, but sand, dry sand, has a heat capacity of approximately 0.19 BTU LB DGF, nearly as good as concrete or stone, but with several crucial advantages. Sand is cheap, abundant, and easy to work with. It can be poured into spaces that would be difficult to fill with concrete or stone. It's stable, doesn't require curing or setting time, and can be easily removed or modified if needed. And most importantly for my application, sand has excellent thermal conductivity when properly compacted, meaning heat can move through it relatively easily, allowing it to function as a thermal battery. My idea was simple. Fill the crawl space beneath my cabin with sand, creating a massive thermal mass directly under my living space. During the brief Minnesota summer, that sand would absorb heat from the warm ground and from solar gain through the cabin. During the long winter, it would release that stored heat slowly, warming the floor from below and reducing the heating load on my furnace. The calculations were straightforward. My crawl space was approximately 800 square feet in area and 3 feet deep, giving me about 2,400 cubic feet of volume. Sand weighs approximately 100 pounds per cubic foot when compacted, meaning I could fit about 240,000 pounds, or 120 tons, of sand in that space, with a heat capacity of 19 BTU LBDGF. That mass could store approximately 45,600 BTUs for every degree of temperature change. If I could raise the temperature of that sand mass by just 20 degrees during summer and fall, I'd store over 900,000 BTUs of energy that would be released slowly during winter. For context, my cabin required approximately 20,000 BTUs per hour to maintain comfortable temperatures during cold weather. That stored energy could provide 45 to 60 hours of heating, or supplement my furnace for much longer periods by reducing the temperature differential between the floor and the living space. The theory was sound. The physics was solid, but when I explained my plan to my neighbors, they thought I'd lost my mind. I first mentioned the idea at a community gathering in May 2019. We lived in a small cluster of cabins, about 15 properties within a mile of each other, and we'd get together monthly to discuss community issues, share news, and socialize. When I explained that I was planning to fill my crawl space with sand to improve heating efficiency, the reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard," said Carl Peterson, a retired contractor who lived 2 properties over. "Sand? You're going to fill your crawl space with sand. That's going to create moisture problems, foundation issues, pest infestations. You're going to destroy your cabin's structural integrity." His wife Margaret was equally dismissive. "Ray, you're a smart man, a physics teacher. But this idea is crazy. Sand doesn't heat anything. It's just going to make your crawl space into a giant sandbox. You should be adding insulation, sealing air leaks, doing normal weatherization. Not filling your foundation with sand." Other neighbors chimed in with similar concerns. They worried about moisture, about the weight of the sand potentially damaging the foundation, about rodents and insects making homes in the sand, about resale value and building codes. Nobody understood the thermal mass concept, and nobody believed that sand could possibly improve heating efficiency. My wife Linda was supportive but concerned. She trusted my physics knowledge, but she also worried about the cost and the risk. "Ray, are you sure about this?" she asked. 60 tons of sand is going to cost money we'd planned to use for other things. What if it doesn't work? What if the neighbors are right about moisture or structural problems? I showed her my calculations, explained the physics, walked her through the potential energy savings. If this works the way I think it will, we could reduce our heating costs by 30–40%, maybe more. That's $600, $800 per year in savings. The sand will cost about $1,200 delivered. It'll pay for itself in 2 years, and then it's pure savings for as long as we live here. Linda agreed to let me try it, though I could see she had doubts. The neighbors were less diplomatic. When the dump trucks arrived in June 2019, carrying load after load of sand, people came out to watch and comment. Carl Peterson stood in his driveway shaking his head, making sure I could see his disapproval. "There goes the neighborhood," he said loudly enough for me to hear. Ray Chen, the physics teacher who thinks he's smarter than everyone else, filling his crawl space with sand. "This is going to be a disaster. We'll be watching, Ray. And when this fails, when you have to dig all that sand out and fix whatever damage it causes, we'll all remember that we tried to warn you." I ignored the comments and focused on the work. The process of filling the crawl space took 3 days. The dump trucks would back up to access points I'd created in the foundation skirting, and we'd use chutes to direct the sand into the crawl space, spreading it evenly to create a uniform layer. I'd installed moisture barriers first, heavy plastic sheeting that would prevent ground moisture from wicking up into the sand. I'd also installed temperature sensors at various depths in the sand and in the cabin floor, wanting to document the system's performance with hard data. By the end of June, the crawl space was completely filled with sand, compacted and level, creating a solid thermal mass beneath my entire cabin. The sand had cost $1,200 delivered, and the moisture barrier and sensors had added another $300. Total investment, $1,200. Now came the waiting period. I needed to let the sand absorb heat during the summer and fall, charging the thermal battery before winter arrived. I monitored temperatures daily, watching as the sand slowly warmed from its initial 45-degree temperature to 55 degrees in July, 65 degrees in August, and eventually reaching about 70 degrees by late September. The thermal mass was charging exactly as I'd calculated it would, absorbing heat from the warm ground below and from the cabin above, storing energy that would be released during the cold months. My neighbors watched and waited for the disaster they'd predicted. They expected moisture problems, foundation settling, pest infestations, any of the issues they'd warned about. But none of those problems materialized. The moisture barrier worked perfectly. The foundation showed no signs of stress from the additional weight, and the sand, being dry and compacted, didn't attract pests any more than the empty crawl space had. By October, as temperatures started dropping and heating season approached, I was confident the system would work. The sand beneath my cabin was 25 degrees warmer than it had been when I'd installed it, storing approximately 1.1 million BTUs of energy. That stored heat would be released slowly over the winter months, warming my floor and reducing my heating costs. But I didn't tell my neighbors about my confidence. I wanted to let winter prove the concept, wanted the results to speak for themselves. The first cold snap came in early November, temperatures dropping into the 20s at night. This was the moment of truth. November 2019 brought typical Minnesota cold, with temperatures dropping into the 20s and 30s during the day and teens at night. This was when I'd normally start seeing significant propane bills, when the furnace would run constantly trying to keep the cabin comfortable. But this year was different. The first thing I noticed was the floor temperature. In previous winters, our floors had been ice cold, maybe 55-60 degrees even when the cabin air was 68 degrees. Walking barefoot was uncomfortable, and we'd covered every surface with rugs and carpets to provide insulation between our feet and the cold floor. This November, the floors were noticeably warmer. I measured them at 64 to 66 degrees, warm enough that walking barefoot was actually pleasant. The sand beneath the cabin was releasing stored heat, warming the floor from below, creating a radiant heating effect that made the entire cabin feel more comfortable. The second thing I noticed was that the furnace was running less frequently. In previous years, the furnace would cycle on every 20-30 minutes during cold weather, running for 10-15 minutes each time to maintain temperature. This year, it was cycling on every 45-60 minutes, running for shorter periods. The warm floor was reducing the overall heating load, making it easier for the furnace to maintain comfortable temperatures. I monitored my propane usage carefully, comparing it to the previous year's consumption. In November 2018, we'd used 110 gallons of propane. In November 2019, we used 75 gallons. That was a 32% reduction in fuel consumption, translating to about $140 in savings for the month. The sand thermal mass was working exactly as I'd calculated it would. But I didn't announce these results to my neighbors yet. I wanted to see how the system performed through the coldest months, through December and January when heating demands were highest and when any weaknesses in the design would become apparent. December brought serious cold, with temperatures regularly dropping below zero at night and rarely rising above the teens during the day. This was the real test of the sand thermal mass system. I continued monitoring temperatures throughout the system. The sand mass, which had started the winter at 70 degrees, was slowly cooling as it released stored heat. By mid-December, it had dropped to about 62 degrees, still significantly warmer than the outside ground temperature of 20 to 25 degrees. That 40-degree temperature differential meant the sand was acting as a thermal buffer, preventing cold from penetrating up through the floor, while continuing to release stored heat into the cabin. My floors remained warm, 62-64 degrees throughout December, and my furnace continued to run less frequently than in previous years. My propane consumption for December was 95 gallons, compared to 145 gallons the previous year, a 34% reduction. I was saving approximately $200 per month on heating costs, and the cabin was more comfortable than it had ever been. My neighbors started noticing things. Carl Peterson stopped by one day when temperatures were around 5 degrees, ostensibly to borrow a tool, but really to check on how I was surviving the cold. He expected to find me burning through propane, struggling with the cold floors that the sand was supposedly making worse. Instead, he found me in a t-shirt, comfortable in a cabin that was 68 degrees, with floors that were warm to the touch. "Ray, your cabin is warm," he said, looking around with confusion. "And your floors." He bent down and touched the floor with his bare hand. "Your floors are actually warm. How is that possible? It's 5 degrees outside. Your floors should be ice cold." "The sand," I explained. "It absorbed heat during the summer and fall, and now it's releasing that heat slowly during winter. It's acting like a thermal battery, storing energy when it's abundant and releasing it when it's needed. The sand is currently about 62 degrees, which is 40 degrees warmer than the ground outside. That warmth is radiating up through the floor, keeping my feet warm and reducing my overall heating load." Carl touched the floor again, feeling the warmth, and I saw his expression change from skepticism to something that might have been respect. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "I thought you were crazy, thought you were wasting money on a stupid idea. But this actually works. Your cabin is warmer than mine, and I'm guessing you're spending less on propane too." "About a third less," I said. "I'm on track to save $600, $800 this winter compared to last year. The sand cost $1,500 to install, so it'll pay for itself in 2 years. After that, it's pure savings for as long as I live here." Carl was quiet for a moment, then asked the question I'd been expecting. "Do you think this would work for other cabins? Could I do the same thing with my crawl space?" I explained that the concept would work for any building with a crawl space in a climate with warm summers and cold winters. The key was having enough thermal mass to store significant amounts of heat and having a long enough charging period to get the mass up to a useful temperature. Minnesota was actually ideal for this application because we had warm summers that could charge the thermal mass and cold winters where the stored heat was valuable. Word spread quickly after Carl's visit. Margaret Peterson, who'd called my idea crazy, came by to feel the warm floors and ask questions about thermal mass and heat capacity. Other neighbors who'd mocked the sand delivery were now curious, asking if I'd help them assess whether similar systems would work for their properties. By January 2020, the coldest month of the year, my sand thermal mass system was still performing well. The sand temperature had dropped to about 58 degrees, still providing significant warming to the floor and reducing heating loads. My propane consumption for January was 100 gallons, compared to 150 gallons the previous year, a 33% reduction. The system was maintaining consistent performance, even during the coldest weather. But there was an additional benefit I hadn't fully anticipated. The warm floor was creating a more comfortable environment in ways that went beyond just temperature. The radiant heat from below was warming objects in the cabin, not just the air. Furniture, walls, even the air itself felt different, more comfortable, less dry than with forced air heating. Linda noticed that her feet and legs, which usually ached during winter from walking on cold floors, were much more comfortable. We were both sleeping better, feeling healthier, enjoying winter in ways we hadn't in previous years. By the end of winter 2019-2020, the results were undeniable. I'd used 370 gallons of propane for the entire heating season, compared to 550 gallons the previous year. That was a 33% reduction in fuel consumption, translating to approximately $720 in savings. The sand thermal mass had paid for itself in the first winter and would continue saving money for decades to come. But the financial savings, while significant, weren't the most important benefit. The most important benefit was comfort. My cabin was warmer, more pleasant, more livable than it had been before. The warm floors transformed how we experienced winter, made our home feel like a sanctuary rather than just a shelter from the cold. My neighbors who'd called me stupid for using sand were now asking me to help them design similar systems. Carl Peterson hired me to consult on his cabin, and we filled his crawl space with sand in the summer of 2020. Margaret Peterson, despite her initial mockery, did the same. Within 2 years, 5 cabins in our small community had sand thermal mass systems, all reporting similar results. 30–40% reductions in heating costs, warmer floors, improved comfort. The stupid idea had become the smart solution that everyone wanted to copy. By 2022, 3 years after I'd installed my sand thermal mass system, the concept had spread beyond my immediate neighborhood. Word had traveled through the rural Minnesota community, and I was getting calls from people across the region who wanted to understand the physics and potentially implement similar systems. I started giving presentations at community centers and sustainable building workshops, explaining the science behind thermal mass and seasonal heat storage. The key principles were simple enough that anyone could understand them, but they challenged conventional thinking about insulation and heating. Most people think about keeping heat in during winter, I'd explain. They focus on insulation, on creating barriers that prevent heat from escaping. That's important, but it's only half the solution. The other half is thermal mass, the ability to store heat when it's available and release it when it's needed. Sand, concrete, stone, water, these materials can store enormous amounts of energy. A pound of sand can store about 0.19 BTUs per degree of temperature change. That doesn't sound like much until you realize that 120 tons of sand can store nearly 1 million BTUs if you raise its temperature by 20 degrees. That's equivalent to burning 10 gallons of propane, except the energy is free, captured from summer warmth and stored for winter use. The audiences were always skeptical at first, just like my neighbors had been. But when I showed them the data, the temperature logs, the propane bills comparing before and after, the evidence was compelling. I'd reduced my heating costs by a third using nothing but sand and physics. The University of Minnesota Duluth sent researchers to study my system in 2021. They installed additional sensors, monitored temperatures throughout an entire year, and analyzed the thermal performance in detail. Their findings confirmed everything I'd calculated and observed. The sand thermal mass was storing approximately 900,000 1,000 BTUs during the charging period from June through October. It was releasing that heat slowly from November through March, maintaining floor temperatures 8 to 12 degrees warmer than they would have been without the thermal mass. The system was reducing heating loads by 30–35% consistently across multiple winters. But the researchers also discovered something I hadn't fully appreciated. The sand wasn't just storing heat from summer. It was also moderating daily temperature swings, absorbing heat during the day when the sun warmed the cabin and releasing it at night when temperatures dropped. This daily cycling effect provided additional benefits beyond the seasonal storage, creating more stable interior temperatures and reducing the frequency of furnace cycling. The research was published in a renewable energy journal, and suddenly my sand-filled crawl space was being discussed in academic circles. I was invited to speak at a building science conference in Minneapolis to present my findings to architects and engineers who were interested in passive heating strategies. The reception was mixed. Some professionals were intrigued, recognized the potential for thermal mass in residential construction. Others were dismissive, argued that modern insulation and HVAC systems were more effective, that thermal mass was an outdated concept that had been superseded by better technologies. But the homeowners who attended the conference were universally interested. They understood heating costs in a way that many professionals didn't. They knew what it felt like to choose between staying warm and paying other bills. And they recognized that a $1,500 investment that could reduce heating costs by a third was worth serious consideration. By 2023, I'd consulted on over 30 sand thermal mass installations across Minnesota and neighboring states. Each one was unique, tailored to the specific building and climate. But they all shared the basic principle of using sand to store and release heat. The results were remarkably consistent. Most installations achieved 25 to 35% reductions in heating costs, with some reaching 40% in particularly well-suited applications. The payback period was typically 2 to 4 years, after which the systems provided pure savings for decades. But not every installation was successful, and I learned important lessons from the failures. Sand thermal mass works best in buildings with crawl spaces or basements where large volumes of sand can be installed. It works best in climates with warm summers to charge the thermal mass and cold winters where the stored heat is valuable. And it works best in buildings that are already reasonably well insulated, where the thermal mass can supplement rather than replace conventional weatherization. I also learned that the concept could be extended beyond just crawl spaces. Some homeowners built sand-filled walls, creating vertical thermal mass that could store heat from passive solar gain through south-facing windows. Others incorporated sand into floor systems, creating heated floors that stored energy from wood stoves or other heat sources. The principle was always the same. Use sand's heat capacity to store energy when it's available and release it when it's needed. The jealous neighbors who'd called me stupid for using sand had become advocates and collaborators. Carl Peterson had become my closest friend, and we'd worked together on multiple projects. Margaret Peterson ran a small consulting business helping homeowners design thermal mass systems. The community that had mocked my sand delivery was now proud of it, saw it as innovation rather than stupidity. By 2024, 5 years after I'd installed my original system, the sand beneath my cabin was still performing flawlessly. 5 winters of consistent heating, cost reductions, 5 years of warm floors and improved comfort, 5 years of proof that physics works and that simple solutions are often the best solutions. My total savings over 5 winters had been approximately $3,600 in reduced propane costs. The sand had cost $1,500 to install, meaning I'd saved $2,100 net, and the savings would continue for as long as I lived in the cabin. But the real value wasn't just financial. The sand thermal mass had transformed how Linda and I experienced winter. Our cabin was comfortable in ways that went beyond just temperature. The warm floors, the stable temperatures, the gentle radiant heat, all of it created an environment that felt nurturing rather than harsh, that made winter something to enjoy rather than just endure. The physics teacher who'd been called stupid for using sand had proven that understanding basic science could solve real-world problems, that thermal mass, a concept taught in every introductory physics class, could be applied practically to reduce energy costs and improve comfort. That sometimes the simplest solutions, the ones that seem stupid to people who don't understand the underlying principles, are actually the smartest solutions available. My name is Dr. Raymond Chen, and jealous neighbors called me stupid for filling my crawl space with 60 tons of sand. They predicted disaster, warned about moisture and structural problems, mocked me at community gatherings. But that sand kept my cabin 20 degrees warmer than it would have been, reduced my heating costs by 1/3, and proved that physics isn't just theory. It's practical knowledge that can change how we live. The neighbors who called me stupid are using sand now too, benefiting from the same thermal mass principles, saving money and staying warm. That's the story of how sand, the most ordinary material imaginable, became an extraordinary solution to an expensive problem. And the lesson about science, skepticism, and the value of understanding physics well enough to apply it in ways that most people never consider.